going to start with talking about Vulcan and its mythology, because the mythology does come into play with how the interpretation of the planet developed. And we have this picture here is of Vulcan. He's Hephaestus in the Greek. And he was the son of Zeus and Hera, the king and queen of the gods of Olympus. And there's actually a couple of variations of the story about his birth, but the most common is that he was born pretty ugly, and Hera basically tossed him out of Olympus in her disgust. Another one was the two of them got in an argument, and it was Zeus who tossed him off Olympus. In either case, he falls for a day and a half, lands on the earth, breaks his leg, which never develops, so he is the god with a limp, the only Olympian god that has a defect like that. And when he is growing on Earth, he learns how to work with fire and metal. He's the blacksmith. He gets invited eventually to return to Olympus, and he's still pretty pissed. He's angry that he was kicked out and rejected, and he designs a throne for Hera that is gorgeous. It's gold and silver and inlaid mother of pearl. She's delighted, sits down on it, but it's a trap. And when she sits down, it's sprung. There's bands that come out. She cannot get back off the throne. Needless to say, she's pretty upset. Zeus is pretty upset. The gods get involved in the whole thing, but Vulcan won't let her go until 3 days later. Finally, Zeus says, hey, okay, look, come on back, join the gods on Olympus. You can be one of us again and live up here, and we'll treat you right. And to show our goodwill, I'm going to marry you off to Venus. And surprisingly, Venus doesn't actually object to this. So Vulcan releases Hera, comes back to Olympus, and he gets married to Venus. And so it's kind of like this, the most it's the Beauty and the Beast in some ways. It's the most ugly god from some of the tales in Olympus with the most beautiful goddess. Venus has a son, Aeneas, and this is, Hephaestus here, or Vulcan. There's Venus, and he's working on the arms he makes sword and a shield for Aeneas, which proved to be very useful because Aeneas is one of the few heroes who lives through the Trojan War. But all is actually not well, because when he leaves and goes to work, Venus has been having a good time. She invites Mars to come over and play, and the two of them have a hot and heavy affair. She says, hey, coast is clear. Vulcan's gone, come on over. They enjoy the night. Mars makes sure to leave in the morning before Vulcan gets back. And all seems to be fine from their perspective, and Vulcan doesn't seem to know anything. But the secret gets out, and this picture here on the right, this is Apollo with the shiny halo around him. And Apollo is telling Vulcan that, guess what? All this stuff is happening behind your back. So needless to say, Vulcan is not happy. And he returns to his forge, and he makes a net of bronze that is too strong for a god to break, but so fine that it's almost invisible. And here we have the results of making that net. As we saw with Hera, Vulcan's pretty good at revenge. He secretly sets the net in the ceiling of his bedchamber, tells her he's planning to have a weekend away. And sure enough, when he leaves, Venus tells Mars the good news. Mars comes right on over. Meanwhile, Vulcan has invited the gods to come and watch the fun, and you can see them in the upper right-hand corner. Now, in this painting by Alexandre Guillemot, this is pretty mild compared to what the story says about when the net is dropped. It's a far more compromising position with the two of them, and the gods get a good laugh out of the whole thing. Venus, needless to say, is furious and embarrassed. Joseph, have you ever seen one of the stories that says Mars' reaction to this? I've never seen one. They always talk about Venus.
I do not. The source is in the Odyssey. And all
Okay. Well,
the emphasis is on how the guys had just a great time with the show.
yeah.
And Plato used this as an example of why Homeric epics should be banned from his ideal republic. He thought it was just so raunchy from his point of view.
It is pretty raunchy. Well, there is one god that does not seem to partake in all of the laughter as much, and that's Mercury. And he is supposedly also the one who is the first to suggest, hey, it's time to take the net off, let them up. And Venus, she's angry, she's leaving, she's heading out of town, and she invites Mercury for a one-night stand before she goes. They do have a child from that, Hermaphroditus. She and Vulcan, however, actually don't have any children. So this is the basic story behind Vulcan, and you'll see elements of this story as the astrologers are developing their interpretations for Vulcan. All right, so now back to the planet itself. How it was discovered and discarded is very closely tied to Uranus and Neptune. We do need to step back a moment and head for Isaac Newton, the demigod of physics. When he was holed up because the plague was hitting London, he had time to really work on all his ideas about the laws of motion and universal gravitation that get printed up in the Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy and used by astronomers up until Einstein's theory of relativity. And this actually is important in our story, and you'll see how it unfolds as we go along. One of the things that we have happening once we have telescopes is astronomers are starting to take a look at the sky, and with Newton, they're getting some calculations to figure out where things are. But in the 1700s, we're still not quite to the point of making good predictions with that information. Now, supposedly in 1690 and even earlier, people had seen Uranus but thought it was a star. But the official date for the discovery is March 13, 1781. William Herschel uses a homemade telescope, his 7-foot telescope. He sees this disc-like object, but he realizes, well, first, he doesn't realize it's a planet. He just thinks it's a star, and it takes, a couple of years of observations where this star is moving before he's saying, yep, okay, the people who say it's a planet are right. Now, Herschel himself, he was like a lot of astronomers at the time. He actually had been another profession before he turned to astronomy. He was born in Germany, landed in Great Britain when he was 19, and he was a musician. Started out with the oboe, then went to violin, harpsichord, organ, wrote a few musical works, had some symphonies. They even performed a couple of his symphonies in 2002. But we don't, we know him as the astronomer. Now, the interesting part of the story is that Uranus doesn't exactly get a name right away. Herschel, he decides that he should name the planet after King George. So he calls it Georgium Sidus. But that did him well, but it wasn't so well received from other astronomers. Now, for his doing this, he actually gets named the King's Astronomer from King George, and he even talks the king out of about 4,000 pounds to build a big old telescope, that one you saw on the previous slide, this 40-foot telescope. That was built with his sister, sister Carolyn, who actually she's actually acknowledged as his assistant in this and gets paid for her work by the king, making her the first woman in England to have a government position. But so Herschel does really well out of calling it Georgium Sidus. Now, Germany, since he was born in Germany, wouldn't mind having it named, after Herschel, acknowledging sort of his German background, but not King George. And others, actually the first mention was in a couple of years after the discovery, like Bode, the astronomer Bode, they wanted to call it Uranus. So if you look in old astrology books or old astronomy books and you want to see what people are saying about Uranus, you need to look for Uranus, Georgium Sidus, or Herschel as the name of the planet you're hunting for, because it took until 1850 before the name Uranus became consistent. But that was only one of Uranus's problems. Uranus was also had an extreme tilt. Our Earth is 23.5 degrees. Well, Uranus is upended at 98 degrees. But the worst thing was the fact that the orbit is wobbly, and Mercury has the same problem. So this is when Newton's equations come in to try and figure out what's going on. The idea is that as they start using the measurements, there must be another planet. So there must be a planet beyond Uranus. There must be a planet between the Sun and Mercury. Newton's equations were brilliant, but difficult. He used geometric calculations, which are really clumsy to work with when you're trying to do the detailed work these guys were doing. So there's a French mathematician who the French like to call, their version of Newton. He basically takes the geometrical equations, switches them over to calculus. Actually, he works for 6 years on this, and does a 5-volume set. He's wearing all these medals because Napoleon thought it was pretty good, made him a marquis, and he also got honors for statistics and physics and engineering and astronomy. So the guy was pretty brilliant. And he actually becomes important because Leverrier had his work when he was going to school. He learned the calculus from Laplace for calculating planetary orbits. He was known to be quite an excellent mathematician when he was younger, but when he graduated, there wasn't he couldn't do what he wanted to initially. So the only thing that he got was to be working for the burgeoning tobacco industry, because just like today we have the problem with lithium batteries exploding in pockets, well, they had the problem of matches accidentally combusting in their pockets. So he works for quite a while there, but finally he gets an assistantship in astronomy, which is where he wants to be. And one of the first things he does is he challenges Laplace, who's supposedly this great genius, and says, hey, no, Laplace said all these orbits were supposed to be stable, but we can see now with all of our observations that they're not. We've got these perturbations with Mercury and with Uranus. So astronomers with mathematical bent all over the world are starting to explore this problem and starting to hunt for the missing planets. And Leverrier decides Mercury was more interesting. So he leaves Uranus to the rest of the astronomers and starts working on Mercury. And he does get accolades. He's able to figure out the mass for Mercury. And so he's pretty happy with his calculations. And he decides that he's going to make some predictions about it. So didn't want to go there quite yet. Well, I guess we can go there. I'll finish the rest of it off when we get to the next one. Now, as I mentioned, there's other astronomers also trying to work on Mercury, and some of them are doing it through visual observations. One of them actually was a German pharmacist who, once again, switched over to being an astronomer because he thought it was pretty fascinating, and he observed the sun every day for 17 years, trying to find that elusive planet between Mercury and the sun. And he did it by capturing, every clear day, capturing the sunspots and charting them down for 17 years, and never found Vulcan. But he did get accolades because after 17 years, he suddenly realized there was a cycle of sunspots, the 10 and 11 year cycle, and he was the first one to discover that. Now, Leverrier, on the other hand, was working straight from calculation. He was not an observational astronomer. He was a mathematical one. But he was using all of the data that was coming in from people who were getting imagery and working with Laplace's equations. And by 1845, he figures he's got it down. He's working, he thinks he's got a fully accurate orbit for Mercury, and it was due to be transiting the sun, which is actually what this image is a modern transit of Mercury across the sun. And if Mercury is going to be transiting, Vulcan should be somewhere close by, so you should be able to capture both of them. The problem is Mercury's a trickster. Mercury didn't obey the calculations, and Vulcan doesn't show up. So Mercury's late by 16 minutes, which basically, Leverrier had put his reputation on the line with this. He retreats back, turns his back on Mercury the trickster, and decides, okay, I'll go back and I'll work on Uranus instead. So he, over the next year, he tweaks his formula, he rechecks all of his calculations, he grabs as much data as he can, he tests what he's doing, and he makes another prediction. Well, he predicted it in 1846, okay? And so he is actually considered the person who discovered Uranus. But that's actually Neptune, excuse me. Uranus has already been found. He's finding Neptune after doing all these calculations. Has given up on Vulcan, and he's got it right this time round. Now, like Uranus, Neptune had been seen before, but not recognized. On the left are actually this little dot here and this little dot down here are from Galileo's notes over December to January. He was studying Jupiter, and he made note of this other little bright star. Because remember, he had the first telescopes. Now, what's interesting is he probably could have figured out that Neptune was a planet, except for Neptune was set stationary retrograde when he was doing his observations. Although there is a 2003 paper where there's a claim that, well, maybe he did actually know. David Jameson at the University of Melbourne is arguing that, yes, he actually figured it out, but because of the church, nothing could be said. But anyway, when we're back to our story, we generally hear, Leverrier discoverer, and then Johann Gall visually confirmed the calculations. Maybe John Adams had something to do with it, but never really made his stuff public, so he doesn't matter. That actually is the really simple version. Neptune lives up to its reputation in the story of its discovery, which is actually, it's kind of funny how the planets, what happens around their discovery is actually every bit as important, I think, in learning how to interpret them or what they might mean. For Neptune, the confusion and fallout has actually lasted from 1846 through to at least 2000, and with some astronomers, there's still some arguments going on. It was basically, the story is, about an inspirational application of the theory, mathematical theory by Leverrier, but it's also whodunit controversy when you're trying to figure out who was really the first person who made a prediction or figured it out. You also have a naming scam. Leverrier wants to call it Neptune initially and says that, hey, the French Society has already totally approved the name. No problem, I can name it. And then it turns out they hadn't. So then he goes, well, since I found it first, I should get naming rights, and I want it named after me. It should be called Leverrier if we're calling Uranus after Herschel. And that basically comes into a whole controversy. The media of all, news media of all three countries involved, Germany and France and England, get into it in a news war. It starts to almost causes an international incident on political side. And then later, when researchers are trying to figure out what's going on, they can't find the papers. All the papers related to the discovery of Neptune have vanished from the Royal Greenwich Observatory Library, and they're not found for 30 years until 1999 in Chile by a researcher who has denied having any knowledge of them. And when he dies, they actually discover these papers plus a number of rare books and other things in his house. So, it's like all the different pieces of confusion and inspiration and all the rest of it that we assign to Neptune have played out over the years there. And the last irony is that if Leverrier and Adams had actually done their calculations at a different point in Neptune's orbit, they both would have been wrong. The only time that you could have found Neptune pretty close to their calculations would have been between 1840 and 1850. If Neptune had been another 100 years long in its orbit, it wouldn't have worked. So it's just, it's one of those lovely little sorts of serendipities that occur. All right, so let's back to Vulcan. In the years since Uranus's discovery, Leverrier has basked in all the attention. He's become ever more prominent. He's appointed the director of the Paris Observatory. He's got accolades, and he's not exactly graceful about the whole thing. He alienates the English and annoys even the French because he's remarkably arrogant and assertive, but he doesn't care. Over the next 10 years, he gives speeches and lectures and does his duty, but he still works on the elusive planet Vulcan. And he gathers a whole lot more information this time. He's refined his calculations. He has a whole lot more data from observations. And in 1859, he feels he is ready to make another prediction. And so he puts it out there that in December of 1859, yep, I've got enough. You should be able to put your telescopes and discover this new planet between Venus and the Sun. And he does receive a letter from a French astronomer who says, hey, yeah, I found it. Leverrier's, been burned once, so he's a little more suspicious. He goes and he actually meets with the guy, he interrogates him over the course of a week, and then when he comes back home, he says, yep, we've got a new planet. Now, the world, takes the stride takes the discovery in stride. They've had 2 new planets already, and they're Uranus and Neptune, and they're figuring, hey, another one, pretty cool. And of course, everybody who's an astronomer wants to see it. So, they're waiting for eclipses. They want to see when you have transits of the sun. They're using these calculations. Some astronomers are sending the notices saying from as early as 1818, hey, I did see it, but didn't realize it was a planet at the time. You've got new ones coming in. But over time, you can't seem to pin it down. And if you take all the various sightings that supposedly are reliable, They don't match the predicted orbit. And so there's this, no, it doesn't exist. And yes, it exists. Our technology is just not good enough yet to see it. So back and forth and back and forth. Leverrier dies in 1877, but the search, even though it slows down, doesn't completely halt. Now, what were the astrologers doing through all of this? Actually, not much initially. Nowadays we see a new asteroid or new planet, and it's like the astrologers within months, we have interpretations going out and people claiming what it really means. Not quite so quickly. The first references to Uranus don't happen in the 1700s. They don't really show up more until the 1800s. Same thing with Neptune. It takes a little while for things to catch on. So initially, when we have Vulcan maybe as a planet, you get reference, like Madame Blavatsky here, saying supposed to have been discovered, named by anticipation, Vulcan, but you don't have a whole lot. Here's another reference. This is from Alan Leo, where once again he says, okay, Vulcan will be rediscovered during the coming century, not much doubt to it, but we don't really know what we're doing, so I'm just going to confine any remarks I make to Mercury. That is up until we get to the 1900s and Lewis Weston. Now, Lewis Weston publishes a brochure. It includes his ideas about Vulcan, and more importantly, it's providing calculations, which means you can actually develop an ephemeris, although he doesn't provide one. He gives sort of a tentative one in this booklet, but he does say, I've taken Leverrier's calculations, I've taken the observations, I've made all these mathematical assumptions. You can go check them and see what they are. And he also tosses in a little bit about the mythology of Vulcan, that the planet is matching the mythology, and then he goes into these kind of weird little side trips on saying historically there was ancient peoples had worshipped an invisible planet that was so bright, so maybe they actually had some knowledge of this Vulcan. But one of the main things he does in that booklet is this symbol right here on the right, upper right, is the symbol he gives for Vulcan, which is still used, although you'll also see the V. And I do think it's funny that the live long and prosper symbol from our Vulcan, Spock from Star Trek, is the V of the planet Vulcan. Kind of a nice little thing. So when Weston interprets Vulcan, he's using the mythology and the astronomy. So combustible, fiery, explosive. He associates it with the Earth's atmosphere. Although one of the more interesting things he does with it is he says that because Vulcan's no more than 8 degrees away from the sun, that's as far away from the sun as you'll ever see it. I mean, you know that Mercury is never, because of our position in our orbit with Mercury between us and the sun, it's never more than 28 degrees away. He feels that with Vulcan's orbit, it is never more than 8 degrees away. And that's the reason for the ancient doctrine of combustion and the via combustia. So, which is kind of an interesting concept there. He's good friends, Weston's good friends with Llewellyn George, who is of the Llewellyn publishing family. He's the one who wrote the A to Z delineator. He had a magazine in the early 1900s where he would get, just like Broughton's Astrological Reader in the 1800s, readers would write in their astrological observations and findings. And so this is just a letter to the editor from that magazine where he's saying, now Vulcan in my findings, he rules Aries instead of the old ruler Mars. From my own experience being born a Capricorn with Aries rising, Saturn and Vulcan have far more effect on my life than Saturn and Mars. All the transits of the planet Vulcan over places of my planets, all aspects to him, radix or progress, bring marked peculiarities. He produces events of a destructive nature. Although in health, he produces many more indications of fever and inflammation than Mars. So this is, sort of what some of the first early ideas, which changed quite a bit. But while astrologers are just starting finally to do interpretation, Einstein kills Vulcan. And it all comes down to 42 minutes. Einstein has been working on his theory of relativity and the effect of mass, of gravitation, especially in massive objects like the sun. So he decides to use the planet Vulcan as an experiment. So he, does it exist? Does it not exist? So he uses his new mathematics that he's been developing to calculate Mercury's orbit and the 42-minute difference between the Newton-Laplace calculations that Leverrier used and Einstein's calculations. That 42-minute difference is gone. And that difference is over 100 years. I mean, this is a very minute difference that they're looking at. So once Einstein does this, pretty much the astronomers give up on Vulcan, except for a little tiny blip. In the 1970s, there's a professor at a New England college who basically, he'd never really completely given up on it, and he and his associates on their photographic plates detect objects close to the sun during a solar eclipse, and it looks as if they may have found Vulcan. So over the next couple of years, it gets this interest in the astronomical community, and one of the people known for all his work on the Mariner space mission to Mars and working for NASA and doing some amazing. He kind of goes, somehow I really hope there is a Vulcan. But it turns out, when they really look more closely at it, that it probably was a comet that had come too close to the sun to escape. So it did orbit for a short period before it crashed. But back to our early 1900s and the astrologers. Just as Einstein is starting to say, the astrologers are starting to say, this long 60-year search for this very elusive planet is finding an echo. And so this is around the time of World War I, just as we're really getting underway. And of course, this is from McGregor. She was an astrologer in the US. And he's looking at this and saying, okay, judging from the date of its discovery, the characters of its newest neighbors, in other words, Uranus and Neptune, it may very well be the genius of the times, the progressive awakening spirit which has sent the world farther in the last 100 years than in the 100 before it. And this is where we're really starting to get this connection from a spiritual sense. Around the same time, we're starting to have the development of different styles of esoteric astrology. Now, esotericism in general is basically the idea that all the world's wisdom has some kind of a common thread, and so its roots in Western esotericism reach back predominantly to Gnosticism, Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, stuff from the Hellenistic period, which gets somewhat modified with the founding of the Theosophical Society by Madame Blavatsky. She basically really sets the stage for how we think in many ways about astrology, how we practice astrology, what we do with things. She's working with it. Your teachings for her basically can come from anywhere. And in the astrological community there, and based from the Theosophical, there's also accompanying this idea, an idea that there were somehow these spiritual masters that we can contact or that occasionally contact us. And so you have a couple of different threads about how this esoteric approach should be. Alan Leo, it's a little more pragmatic. Alice Bailey is basically the laws that govern the evolutionary of the solar system govern the evolution of humanity, as above, so below. This is certainly a phrase used in other contexts, but she's really a very strong, because of her influence, it really resonated throughout the astrological community because there was a strong spiritual bent through this time frame too. And the other sort of interesting part about how some of this works is she not only does this work with the astrology and the Theosophical side, she actually sort of redefines in a whole new system of astrology. So Alice Bailey, she's basically the reason that Vulcan is still used by astrologers. She was born in England, came to the United States with her husband, who became a minister, and things did not work out. She divorced him, had to support her 3 children, and along the way she discovers Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society. Now in her work, she says she was contacted by Dwalkul, who's in most of the writings you find his name just put as DK, who tells her he is a living Tibetan Lama and has contacted her telepathically to enlist her help. So for 30 years, she wrote an enormous number of books about what he told and the ideas she received. And she always said that it was actually different than channeling. So Madame Blavatsky is the picture on the left, Alice Bailey is the one on the right. She discovered the Theosophical Society. She became rose quite high in the ranks. She remarried Foster Bailey, who was one of the, he was the secretary, I think, of the Philosophical Society.
Yes. Yeah.
And they basically, with her work and her perspective, they have a major falling out. There's a lot of astrologers who came out of the Theosophical Society. Alan Leo, Dane Rujar, Alice Bailey, Aleister Crowley, a lot of splinter groups actually that came out as well, like the Golden Dawn. So this was not that unusual to have a splinter group come out, but she breaks away. She and her husband found the Lucis Trust, which still exists. You can still get to their website. They have all of the Alice Bailey material on there. And she essentially creates this whole style of esoteric astrology that when you hear someone today just say esoteric astrology, although that term esoteric is huge, most of the time they're actually specifically referring to Alice Bailey's version, which has been modernized and sort of brought up to date with Alan Oken, who you may have heard of. He's still alive and teaching. Now yes, we are here. Okay. So Blavatsky basically started the Renaissance of interest in astrology with the Theosophical Society. Alice Bailey kicks the combination of spiritualism or spiritual approach and astrological approach into high gear. There's just no way we have time to cover her entire system, but it was really the primary spiritual path in the astrological community up through the 1970s, 1980s, and then sort of faded back as evolutionary astrology with writings that were more updated language and a little easier to grasp caught the attention of astrologers and became more prominent. But there's still a worldwide community of esoteric astrologers who follow Alice Bailey's work. A couple of the basic premises is that we begin as divine and we descend through matter, very similar to ideas you find way back in Hellenistic times. We descend into matter for purposes of service and experience. And our mission, if you choose to accomplish it, essentially here on Earth, is to develop ourselves spiritually sufficiently to return back to the divine origins. So the involutionary is the path of descent into matter and to here on Earth, and the evolutionary arc is the path of return. And the other important concept is the idea that in that sense of being divine, we're also part of the One. And the One expresses itself in 7 radiant qualities. And as basically the solar system is essentially alive, and these qualities are permeated throughout, and part of what astrology does is show you how the soul has chosen in its incarnation a time which expresses the qualities of that soul. Now, another major component of that's different than what we normally use in astrology is this division between sacred and non-sacred planets, and the addition of quite a few more rulers. well, not quite a few, but there's 2 additional rulers. She acknowledges the traditional, what we have, our standard, the classical rulers with the addition of the modern planets. But she says the spiritual rulers of the signs are different than that. The one that's used most often by astrologers is the esoteric ruler, which is the ruler of the sign when the person has stepped onto the spiritual path. And Vulcan falls in that category. It is not part of the exoteric rulership. And there's also a hierarchical ruler, which is related to the concept of the 7 rays and the spiritual path and paths of initiation. So after you hit a certain level of initiation onto the spiritual path, then the hierarchical ruler takes over. So here's that rulership scheme. So for Taurus, Venus is still the standard exoteric ruler, but Vulcan is the esoteric ruler and the hierarchical ruler. And then each sign is also associated with one of those 7 rays, and each planet is associated with one of the 7 rays. And each planet in its association with a ray has this sacred or non-sacred expression. And it's a little bit of an interesting sort of division. It's not just unique to Alice Bailey, this idea that there were sacred planets. You see that in Alan Leo's work, some of the theosophical perspectives. But she's a little bit different with it because it's tied into this complete system that she's developed. And so the sacred side is when you have begun these initiations into the spiritual path. And the non-sacred planets are essentially the ones that are for your day-to-day living, and they can point you on the path, but it's the other planets that take you on the path. So the sacred, our Vulcan is the first of the sacred in her system. Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, which leaves Mars as a non-sacred planet, the Earth as another one, Pluto, and then she uses kind of an odd term in a way. It's called the moon veiling and the sun veiling. There is a spiritual side of both the sun and moon, but there's also a side where they are veils that shield basically shield fragile human consciousness from the full impact of the sacred planets, particularly Vulcan, Neptune, and Uranus. Vulcan ruling the etheric world, Neptune the astral world, and Uranus the mental world. So the veil is basically protecting lower hierarchies from the full radiance of the representation of the body, soul, and mind of the solar logos, or the soul of the solar system. Did I get that right, Joseph? I've been reading and reading on it.
I am impressed that you're able to talk like this.
Joseph and I have done a lot of work where I have gotten into Alice Bailey's work in my very early days as an astrologer, but then kind of shifted away. And so it's interesting coming back to try and re-understand her system. It is fairly complex. Here is a sketch of the 7 rays by the planets. And as you can see, some of the rays have just a sacred planet, but most have both the non-sacred and the sacred. So the first ray, which relates to will and power, is Vulcan as the sacred planet, Pluto as the non-sacred. And as you can see, we have ray 2, love and wisdom, with Jupiter and the sun. Ray 3, your active intelligence. And the active intelligence is kind of a mediating ray in one sense, as far as I can understand it. I will admit I'm not an expert on this. So for those of you who know esoteric astrology, please forgive me or make commentary. The rays, especially the 4, 5, 6, and 7, along with 3, form aspects of mind. But these radiant qualities, basically, these are all in each planet in your chart. You can actually sort of see how you express out into the world through looking at these different, and which planets you have in different signs, so you can kind of combine. It's sort of like a little bit like a point system, like Ptolemy's point system for essential dignities, where you can sort of add up, well, you know, Vulcan is ray 1. I have it in this sign, that sign's ray 1. Okay, there's 2 for there. You know, Jupiter's in the same sign. Well, Jupiter's only a ray 2, but you know, so you can basically kind of do this. Well, Joseph actually has created a grid in our class on soul for people to be able to do this, but it's a fascinating way of working with your chart. If you do want to get interested in this, I highly recommend starting with Alan Oken's book, Soul-Centered Astrology. Michael Bartlett here at Kepler, who teaches classes, he's going to have a class in the fall on esoteric astrology. But trying to read through Alice Bailey's, the language is very 18th century, and a number of the attitudes are very 18th century. So you might have a bit more of a slog to try to get into it through there.
Well, it's like religious proclamation literature, which means if you're already convinced that this is the truth, it's easy to read. But if you're coming from the outside, it's very difficult.
Yeah, it takes a bit. And like I say, if you go out to the Lucius Trust, there's like 24 of her books. There's a lot of repetition, a lot of things where you see a partial thought in one book, but it doesn't complete the thought until another book. So it's not the easiest to read to get through. It's kind of like Jeffrey Wolf Green book on evolutionary astrology can be sometimes a bit more difficult to try work through than Stephen Forrest, because Stephen has organized it much more easily. I
mean, in the sense, this is similar to learning Vedic astrology. You have to make a real commitment to do it. And you can't read a few keywords and put up your shingle. You have to really spend some time and sort of contemplate the whole thing, and that takes some ripening.
Yeah, and as you can see, getting used to thinking about these other rulers as the spiritual rulers, it does make a different way of approaching. But here's what she says about Vulcan as the esoteric ruler for Taurus. And she starts out using from the mythology, Vulcan, the forger of metals, the one who works in the densest, most concrete expression of the natural world from the human angle, the one who goes down into the depths to find the material upon which to extend his innate art and to fashion that which is beautiful and useful. Now you see some echoes of Pluto here, and it's interesting that Ray 1 is both Vulcan and Pluto. But for Pluto, the gems of the world, are down in the underworld. You do have to go down deep. But for Vulcan, in this going down deep, it's the planet that in its mythology where that is brought up to the surface. It is hammered, it is formed, it is chipped away in the gems to make something beautiful. So Vulcan stands for the soul, or the individual inner spiritual man. In his activity, we find the key to the soul's task upon the eternal round of the wheel of life. She also talks in this part of esoteric astrology. She has a 5-volume set on esoteric astrology. And she says Vulcan, on a mundane level, rules nations at a certain stage of embryonic soul expression, such as the present, and governs their activities, fashioning the instruments of war when war and conflict are the only means whereby liberation can come. Though woe betide those through whom wars come. In other words, she's writing this during World War II. She has also lived through World War I, and both of those two wars, especially for the people who lived through both, did a major scarring on the soul, I think. It was difficult enough especially for those who were born in Europe or lived in Europe, not quite as much for those in the United States because we were protected more from the results, the upfront in-your-face results. But for those who weren't, you'll find a lot of the spiritual, really deep spiritual work coming out from their perspective of having lived through this. So in her idea, in the present war, in World War II, Vulcan is concerned along with Venus in the relation of man to man and man to the mineral kingdom. Venus, the mental energy of humanity, establishes the relation between man and man, between nation and nation, while Vulcan establishes the relation between the fourth kingdom and nature and the first. In other words, the densest matter and the spirit. This is another part of the book where she revisits the connection, where she's actually making linkages of the spiritual path. And we have, in the struggle for spiritual growth, especially when you're talking about any planets in Taurus, you have 3 symbols of light. You have the eye of illumination, the bull's eye. Exoterically, the physical sun. Remember, the physical sun is a non-sacred, so it's the starting point. Then you have Vulcan, the one who reveals that which is deeply hidden, brings it to the light. So esoterically, this is where we get to the heart of the sun. So we're starting to reach the spiritual side of the sun. And the sun as the great illuminator, the central spiritual sun. Thus, from every angle, illumination remains the theme of this sign. And then there's a very poetic phrase. The depths have been reached. There's no more to be done. So here we have that depths that Vulcan is representing. The light from the eye of the bull, which with ever-increasing radiance has guided the struggling soul, must give place eventually to the light of the sun. For Vulcan is a substitute for the sun. It's spoken of sometimes as being veiled by the sun, and others it stands for the sun itself. Between the man and the sun, the soul. So this is a little bit confusing, right? First she's saying sun's a non-sacred planet, and then here in this passage she's talking about the sun as being sacred and Vulcan as a substitute for the sun. But in essence, when you get into our whole system, it's essentially that as you're working on the path, Vulcan is when you step on the path. It's that will, that first ray. And so this would be an and remember that it is also no more than 8 degrees from the sun. So it is the indicator that of when you step on the path, of when you're going down into the depths. And so it is closely tied to the spiritual side of the solar energy. And I believe the light of the eye in Taurus is the Pleiades, if I recall my astronomy.
Yes, Aldebaran is the eye of the bull.
Aldebaran, okay. All right, now Alan Oken, here's just a brief quote from him where he's talking about, on a soul level, Vulcan is primarily planet of the first ray. It's a life in Taurus is chosen to teach an individual how to transmute material desire into spiritual will. And notes that with Vulcan, we enter upon one of the most esoteric aspects of soul-centered astronomy, or astrology, because astronomers haven't found it. Astrology actually has a pretty rich tradition of having planets that astronomers haven't found yet. Because in that late 1800s, early 1900s period, you also have the beginnings of Uranian astrology, where there's 9 hypothetical planets that haven't been found yet. And yet the Uranian astrologers say that they use them to great effect. So in esoteric astrology, we find that Vulcan can still be used to great effect. There is one little side trip if you go hunting out on the internet, and it doesn't seem to be prominent, but Lynn Coyner, Linda Goodman, and there's a few other people out there who take this well, there's more than just this paragraph of the moon paren Vulcan. In other words, the moon veiling Vulcan, that is the moon being a protector of people who are not yet on the spiritual path. But Vulcan is there and present, is an esoteric ruler of Virgo, which is similar to the Orthodox ruler. But the moon as a fourth ray energy is seen as an expression of first ray energy manifesting through Vulcan. The moon rules the form and the will of God to manifest through the medium of form. So
and
you will.
the fourth ray is harmony through conflict.
Right.
And so we're looking at the conflict between the spiritual and material.
And so what you have in Linda Goodman's books, she wrote Sun Sign Astrology, with the most popular astrology book ever written. And she made the most money from it for the time of any astrology book ever written. She also wrote Star Signs, Love Signs. She wrote quite a few things. But she has a phrase in them where Vulcan's the true ruler of Virgo, the lame goddess of thunder, since Vulcan is definitely a female planet, which I find kind of interesting. It's the only place I've seen a reference to Vulcan as a female planet. But she says, I guess because it's ruler of Virgo, female sign. And then she says, let me explain what I mean by a true ruler. And what that means is she feels that each of the signs should have an individual planet, no dual rulerships. So as we discover new planets, each one should get one of those new planets. That new planet becomes the true ruler. So for her, Neptune was the true ruler for Pisces. Pluto the true ruler of Scorpio, Uranus the true ruler of Aquarius, and Vulcan would become the true ruler of Virgo. This is an idea that is basically, once again, making a different rulership scheme than traditional. So this is more an affinity rulership scheme, which is still being worked out by astrologers. And then there's another Peter Kabuska. He's up on the internet. He's an esoteric astrologer who is also thinking about those lines of Virgo being ruled by Vulcan. That he goes back to the mythology, working with fire, the repeated hammering, and thinking of that in spiritual terms, like the repetition of a mantra or the repetition of a song, to build links between the parts for the sake of a whole. And also that Virgo is connected to the gestation process, or the labor pains one undergoes in giving birth to an idea, creative work, or even a child, so that Vulcan in this, as a mediator of the spirit in that process, it's the staying power and the endurance of the spiritual will during that painstaking time. Because if you're thinking about what we're talking, Vulcan in this spiritual sense is not actually being represented by the god in that image. It's being represented by the process of what that steel is undergoing to become a sword. It's being heated, it's being hammered, it's being going through a whole lot to become, well, in this picture, a weapon, although I suppose you can also use some of the spiritual terminology for swords, of the sword of truth. You know, we have those kinds of terminologies where it can cut through the illusions and, you know, basically the idea that the spiritual path is not necessarily an easy path. In most cases, it's not. Actually, I don't think I've ever heard of anybody on a spiritual path who's had an easy time with it. It's usually because we usually get onto the spiritual path because of crisis, and we usually continue with it because we're trying to resolve all of the things that have been created by crisis. And it's not, so Vulcan is kind of that representation of what we need to really work through all of the imperfections and blockages and all the various things that stand in our path. And oh yes, comment there. Many people claim Chiron is the ruler for Virgo. Yes, and actually there's about 6 different potential alternate rulers for Virgo, because with the Ceres becoming a dwarf planet, there is also an argument that because Ceres is an agricultural goddess, she should be ruling Virgo. I think I've seen one where there was a suggestion that Juno, the asteroid, should be a ruler of Virgo. Anyway, or was it and I think maybe Haumea Makemake has also been proposed as a ruler for Virgo. I don't know why everybody picks on Virgo. Nobody picks on Gemini. It's also ruled by Mercury. Everybody wants to get the sign that has a dual rulership and exaltation by Mercury and kick that out. But anyway, sidetrack there. All right. So one other thought that I found fascinating, Benjamin Schiller's another esoteric astrologer, and I've got his website there. He wonders whether Vulcan might actually be just a power point. Like we use the lunar nodes as a power point, the connection of the orbit of the moon with the orbit of the Earth around the sun. Maybe Vulcan is a power point as the barycenter of the solar system. And a barycenter, all that fancy word means is that it's the gravitational center of a couple of celestial bodies. For example, the Earth and the Moon are often referred to by astronomers as a dual planet system because the barycenter of the orbit of the Moon around the Earth is actually not the center of the Earth. It's about 3,000 miles out from the center. So the Earth, in a sense, is also orbiting the Moon. So the idea, and the solar barycenter is actually not directly in the center of the sun, if you take all the mass of the solar system. So he's proposing that perhaps Vulcan is a representation of this barycenter. And to him, Vulcan would be the invisible innermost aspect and Pluto the invisible outermost aspect. Both of these planets are assigned to the first ray, so he's going, well, it would make sense. And I think it's an intriguing idea.
It's also analogous to the Ptolemaic setup, where the center of the solar system upon which you would calculate the planet's movement would not be the Earth, but a point sort of next to the Earth. So it's a really interesting kind of parallel.
It is indeed. All right, so if you find this at all useful, you're probably going to want to figure out, well, where's Vulcan in my chart? And luckily you can do that. If you have Solar Fire or Kepler or Sirius, you can use that software to do it. In Solar Fire, you actually will have two different calculations that are possible. One is Weston's, the guy from 1907 that really started kicking into gear the astrologers using Vulcan. He has an orbit of 19.5 days with a maximum orb of 8 degrees 20 minutes. So you could have Vulcan occasionally if you have the sun like close to the end or the beginning of a sign. They could be in two different signs, Vulcan and the sun, but most of the time they'll be within the same sign. And Dr. Baker, who is actually, who was he anyway? No, I don't remember. Anyway, he was an astrologer, obviously, astronomer, astrologer. His calculation is he's trying to incorporate Einstein's work, the quantum mechanical behavior. So he's postulating that Vulcan is never more than 3 degrees away from the sun. So if Mercury comes within 3 degrees of the sun, then Vulcan itself would be conjunct the sun. And you can choose either one. Now in Solar Fire, when you choose one, the next time you pull up the chart, it'll have that choice. So you'd have to actually specifically change if you want to take a look at the other alternative. And it's under preferences calculations. If you don't have Solar Fire or any of the other big guys, you can go up to astro.com and use the Swiss ephemeris for users. They have two versions of the Swiss ephemeris up there. One is for people who are going to use, make their own, like make an app and want to get the ephemeris to put into the app. And the other one is so that you can just download your own ephemeris tables. And they have a lot of different tables, so you need to sort of scroll down the page to where it has the hypothetical planets, Hamburg School and others. You get 50-year ephemerises, and it includes all of the hypothetical planets from the Uranian Hamburg School, and it includes Vulcan, Selena White Moon, Isis Trans Pluto, a few other ones that are proposed hypothetical planets. But you can get a full ephemeris to find out where Vulcan's in your chart. So I thought it'd be interesting to look at the two people who have been, the one from astronomy, who was important in our discovery of Vulcan, which is Urbain Le Verrier, and then also Louis Weston, the one who made it, kick-started the popularity in the astrological community. So we have Vulcan here in Pisces. Well, we have Sun 3 degrees from Pluto, and then we have Vulcan within, well, just over a degree from the lunar node, the south lunar node. And this is using the true node rather than the average, the mean node. And it is a stationary node, which for those of you who know evolutionary astrology, I am sure you're going, interesting, because that has a lunar node that's stationary in evolutionary astrology has a lot of power. And here is Vulcan, this planet, this more spiritual oriented planet of the will and power, the basic reservoir of power. It is a Ray 1 planet. It is in Pisces, which is a Ray 1 sign, that will and power sign. It has Pluto there, which was also, remember that was the non-sacred Ray 1 planet. And the sun itself is a Ray 2 planet. So we definitely have a lot of strong Ray 1 energy in this one. And Pisces, when you're thinking of it on a more esoteric level, it's well, even on an exoteric level, you know, that in its ultimate side, there's that sacrificial of self through compassionate service. You have Pluto, and in the more esoteric side, as more of a destruction of negativity and separatists, so surrendering personality to soul in that side. And you have it in the 11th house. So you not only have the group of regular astrology, but in the esoteric, you would be translating this into the spiritual side. So spiritual aspirations, spiritual groups, heart-centered groups, being in service to humanity. And Vulcan, in one way, there is a synthesizing planet. So the part of this that would be not so good is if you're putting up with things or seeing yourself as a victim. The part of this that would be good is when you're seeing yourself as being able to contribute out into the world for something more. And in the south node is more of has that quality of karmic, the karma developed by succession of lifetimes of how that's playing out in this lifetime. So if we apply this to Leverrier, that's just going through the basics. You can think about this placement here as, what did Leverrier do in his life? I mean, yes, okay, on his, I can't say that anything I read about him was terribly spiritual, but even with his arrogance, even with his tendency to be, I want to be on top, at the same time, he was really pursuing something far beyond just who he was. He was contributing to a larger knowledge for all of us, working with this international community of astronomers, beyond the time when the astronomer was the astrologer in the 1800s, but astronomers, and expanding our knowledge of our own solar system. Joseph, what else would you say?
Well,
I'll put you on
the spot. Not quite sure. The esoteric ruler of Pisces is Pluto. Mm-hmm. Pisces, I believe, is Ray 6. Aries is Ray 1.
Is Aries the one Ray 1? I thought Pisces was run. I will look it up.
Yeah, okay. I was also curious about the square from Saturn to Vulcan.
Yes.
as well as the lunar, of course, obviously the nodal polarity.
The nodal polarity, I think that's very important, and it's a very close square to the nodes. I mean, Saturn is at the bending of the nodes.
Vulcan will manifest very slowly and not within his lifetime.
Squared to Saturn slows everything down, doesn't it? And that actually too is quite true in terms of his legacy. Sagittarius is Ray 6, and its esoteric is the Earth. Although the Earth in this chart would be located in Virgo because it's always exactly opposite the Sun. If you ever want to figure your Earth, you're going to just put it opposite the Sun. And if you're thinking okay, it's 7th house in this chart, so that's the inner union of the soul and the personality with the other. And Sagittarius, uplifting humanity through revelation of truth and wisdom. So yeah, he certainly did struggle a little bit with doing that.
You also might want to look at this odd sextile between Vulcan and Jupiter, because not only is Jupiter the exoteric ruler of Pisces, but Vulcan is the esoteric ruler of Taurus. There's I don't know if Alice Bailey had mutual receptions by exoteric and esoteric rulers, but here's an example of one.
True, and that Jupiter
I think I'm just having fun. I'm not sure.
Yeah, but when you think about it, and you think of where did he do the prominence of his work, he was not out in the world all the time with this. You know, it's kind of like writers who often have a strong 12th house. As a mathematician, a good chunk of his time was spent separating himself away to work on his calculations and going through things. Connected directly into his connections with the group of astronomers that he was communicating with as they were trading, you know, hey, I got this information, hey, I've got this information. So I think whether Alice Bailey used that kind of mutual reception, I think it's a fertile place to look. Okay, well, that's a quickie look at that chart. Here's Weston's chart. We only have a couple minutes left, but we can look at his. Now, he has Vulcan in the 1st house with, and I'm doing everything in Placidus for those of you who are whole signs, is because this is what Alice Bailey worked in, was Placidus. So I figured I'd use her house system. And so this one's, you know, we don't have sort of the repetition of rays, because if Vulcan's ray 1, the sun is, you know, sun ray 2.
The sun is ray 2, but Vulcan is ray 1, Capricorn is ray 1. So there's a ray 1 emphasis here.
Yeah. So we've got a lot of focus on that with all these planets here. And in this case, one of the interesting pieces is the 5-degree exact square with the Saturn again, only this time the Saturn is up in the 9th. And with the Vulcan, we have a partile square with Neptune.
Right.
Now, one of the more interesting things in doing this is I have a couple of copies of Weston's pamphlet at the office. And on one of them, there is a note from Michael Munchausen. And let's see, let me catch it here. It basically says there are rumors that his book was actually meant to be a farce. And he says there's reliable rumors, so handle with care, which is kind of fascinating, because if it was a farce, it backfired on him or on us, I don't know which you want to say, because it became he did a number of other things astrologically, like he was one of the first astrologers doing financial predictions and stock market book, but he's not remembered for that. He's remembered for his pamphlet on Vulcan. So if the Neptune was being its sly self, that square to Vulcan did not, you know, Vulcan basically transformed it into something else. Which I find, you know, anyway, I just thought that, of course, I now, you know, I only found that this week, a couple of days ago. So now I've got to go track down and see if anybody knows anything more about whether that rumor has anything to do with anything. But,
or it sounds like a pervasive influence of Neptune.
Or just because, the Neptune is also opposite the Saturn. It's conjunct the Moon. Yes. You know,
and there's also this also has a ray 3 emphasis. this chart, especially with Saturn in Libra squaring the Capricorn planets, Capricorn also being array 3. So, here was someone who was, I think he was authentically seeking knowledge. He may have been ironic in part, but he was trying to advance our understanding in his own inimitable way.
And I don't entirely think it was entirely a farce, because he was good friends with Llewellyn George, and they did. He lived in Portland, Oregon. They did have a lot of conversations. There was a large Theosophical Society group in Portland at that time, and he was part of all of that. So I think there might have, even if maybe some part of him sort of said that, nah, I'm not so sure.
Right.
Anyway, that's all what we have time for, other than if there's a few questions that anybody has. For those of you, I hope it looks like a lot of you have discovered that I put the PowerPoints into a couple of different formats. So one is 3 per page and the other is 2 per page. The 3 per page has room for notes. But if I can also, I thought about it, I could also send not just the chart for the rays with the planets, I don't know which page that's on, but a chart for the rays for the signs as well. So if you want to play a little, start playing a little bit with this, I will do that when How do you, basically that's part of it. Interpreting Vulcan in the chart is, in an esoteric world, it's not quite as simple. Vulcan, as a ray 1 planet, is will and power for ray 1. And the planet itself, you think of like that symbol when I was talking about the blacksmith, that Vulcan is a representation of the spiritual work that we need to do to dig down into the depths of us and take what appears to be, like if you've ever seen a rock before it's become a gem, it's pretty doesn't look like much, or a geode. If you break open this plain kind of ugly looking rock and you break it open and suddenly there's these sparkling gems inside. Vulcan is kind of that process spiritually.
Oh, he was also like an Iron Age deity. And so what you have to do is you have to melt the iron ore to get rid of the impurities. Using tremendous amount of heat. It's so much heat that it basically was an ecological disaster for Greece. And so with the molten metal, then you're able to shape it into something beautiful. So there's a transformation of matter, of what's at hand that is impure, and fashioning it into something that can be useful or beautiful.
Right. And it's not just the iron, but the silver and the gold, like in the story, the thrones he's creating are silver and gold, and he's using things of beauty to inlay and work with them. So it's taking things that may be like mother of pearl, is the cast off shells of sea creatures, right? It's not really much anything until you open that shell and you polish it, and so it's combining these found things with the items that take such a huge amount of work and tempering and actually, like when you work with steel, work with metal, particularly in like making armor or the swords, if you don't do it right, you have to quench it, you have to cool it, and then you heat it, and then you cool it, and then you heat it. And you can spend weeks working on something only to have to do it all over again. So when you think of Vulcan, you think of it as in the process of our lives to try understand who we are, to try reach our higher self. It's not a one-time process. It's something that we work on throughout our life, and there's going to be times where we think that, hey, we've come to some kind of realization and understanding, only to discover the next time a crisis comes through, oh yeah, we still got more. And so the planet is representing that kind of process, which I think is why it stuck around in her style of astrology.
It has a resonance.
Yeah, it has a powerful meaning in it. So enjoy thinking about this. Like I said, I put links on a couple of the things, and there's certainly plenty of places that you can go out to. Just looking up Alice Bailey will get you a huge amount of material.
Watch what you ask for.
Watch what you ask for. Like I said, go for Alan Oken first. That's a great entryway into all of this. His book is really good for that. But have fun.
Thank you. Thank you, Enid.